In 1954, thousands of Americans stood outside in the January cold, pressing their faces against department store windows, breath fogging the glass. Not to shop, not to wait for a sale, but to watch a football game. Not because the game was special, because the screen was in color. For the first time in their lives, they were looking at television that looked like the world actually looked. Grass that was green, jerseys that were red and gold, a sky that was blue. Men and women stood on sidewalks in cities across America, in temperatures below freezing, and they did not move. Because what was on the other side of that glass was the future, and the name on the set was RCA. At its peak, RCA was not just a company. It owned NBC. It put the camera on the Apollo 11 spacecraft that showed mankind walking on the moon. Its laboratories in Princeton, New Jersey invented technologies that the rest of the world is still using today. Over 100,000 Americans went to work every morning building something they believed in. By 1987, the entire consumer electronics division had been sold to a French company that had never manufactured a single television set. How does the corporation that invented the American living room end up owned by strangers who never understood what they had bought? His name was David Sarnoff, and he arrived in America with nothing. His name was David Sarnoff, and he arrived in America with nothing. He was born in 1891 in Uzlian, a small village in what is now Belarus. His family was Jewish, his father was a house painter, and when David was 9 years old, they packed what they owned and sailed to New York. They settled on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, in a neighborhood so crowded that families shared walls, shared staircases, shared the same narrow slice of sky between tenement buildings. David's father fell ill almost immediately after arriving. The oldest son, David, went to work. He sold newspapers on street corners. He ran errands. He taught himself English by reading discarded copies of the Herald. At 13, he walked into the office of a telegraph company looking for a messenger job and accidentally walked into the office of the commercial cable company next door. They hired him anyway. He learned Morse code at night after his shifts, tapping out rhythms on any hard surface he could find. Tabletops, his knee, the metal frame of his bed. Within 2 years, he was operating a telegraph key with enough speed and accuracy that Marconi's American office hired him as a junior wireless operator. He was 15 years old. What Sarnoff understood even then was something most people around him did not. The telegraph moved messages between 2 points, but wireless radio moved messages into open air, and anyone with a receiver could hear them. That was not a technical distinction. That was a philosophical one. The telegraph was a conversation. Radio was a voice, and a voice, Sarnoff believed, could reach everyone. In 1912, he was 20 years old and working a wireless station on the roof of Wanamaker's department store in Manhattan, one of several commercial relay points the Marconi Company operated along the eastern seaboard. On the night of April 14th, a distress signal came through the static. A ship called the Carpathia had picked up survivors from another vessel. The other vessel was the Titanic. For 72 hours, David Sarnoff did not leave his post. He relayed the names of survivors to newspapers, to families waiting at the docks, to a nation that had no other way of knowing who had lived. President Taft ordered all other wireless stations in the region to go silent so Sarnoff's signal could be heard clearly. By the time it was over, the entire country knew that radio was not a novelty. It was infrastructure. It was the nervous system of a modern civilization. And David Sarnoff, 20 years old, the son of a house painter from Belarus, had just demonstrated that to the world. 3 years later, in 1915, he wrote a memo to his superiors at Marconi. He called it his radio music box proposal. The idea was simple, and at the time considered slightly absurd. Instead of using wireless technology to send private messages between 2 stations, why not broadcast music, news, and entertainment into every home in America through a small, affordable receiver? He wrote that such a device could be made for about $75 and that the potential market was in the millions of households. His supervisors filed the memo and moved on. Sarnoff did not move on. When RCA was formed in 1919, not by a visionary in a garage, but by an act of corporate and government necessity, Sarnoff was already inside the building. The United States government had grown alarmed during World War I that British-owned Marconi controlled much of America's wireless communications infrastructure. Washington leaned on General Electric to buy out Marconi's American operations and create a domestically owned company. GE, Westinghouse, AT&T, and United Fruit contributed patents. RCA was the result. It was, at its birth, less a company than a legal arrangement, a patent pool designed to keep American airwaves in American hands. What it became was David Sarnoff's life's work. He rose through the organization with the same relentless focus he had applied to a telegraph key in a tenement bedroom. By 1921, his radio music box idea was no longer a memo. It was a product. By 1926, RCA had launched NBC, the National Broadcasting Company, the first permanent radio network in America. By 1930, Sarnoff was president of RCA. He was 39 years old and he was just getting started. His belief, stated plainly and repeated often, was that technology existed to serve human connection. Not commerce first, connection first. Commerce would follow. He wanted radio in every kitchen. He wanted television in every living room. He wanted the American family to be able to sit together and hear the same voice, see the same image, share the same moment, regardless of whether they lived in a Manhattan apartment or on a farm in Nebraska. That was the dream. And for 3 decades, RCA delivered on it with a consistency that no other company in American history has matched in that span of time. What Sarnoff built was not a product line. It was a promise that the future would be shared, that technology would not divide Americans by wealth or geography, but would reach into every home and pull the country together around something common. The first customers were working families who had never owned anything that felt like the future before. They bought RCA radios on installment plans. They gathered around them in the evenings the way earlier generations had gathered around fires. They trusted the name on the box, and the name on the box trusted them back. Because Sarnoff had come from exactly where they were, and he never forgot it. By the mid-1930s, RCA had turned its attention to the next horizon. Sarnoff had seen radio become furniture, become ritual, become the background sound of American life. Now he wanted to do it again, this time with pictures. Television was coming. The only question was who would bring it. The decade was the 1950s, and if you wanted to understand what RCA meant to America, you had to stand inside a living room. The decade was the 1950s, and if you wanted to understand what RCA meant to America, you had to stand inside a living room. Not a showroom, not a store display. A real living room. The kind with a braided rug on hardwood floors, a sofa with armrests that had been sat on so many times the fabric had worn thin, curtains that let in the afternoon light in long yellow strips. In that room, pushed against the wall where the radio used to be, or sometimes replacing the radio entirely, was the television set. And in the early 1950s, in the homes that had one, it was almost certainly an RCA. The sets were large. They were furniture as much as they were appliances. Wooden cabinets with curved screens, dials that clicked when you turned them, a warm amber glow that came from the tubes inside before the picture appeared. You did not simply turn on an RCA television. You waited for it. The image would swim up slowly out of gray static, sharpening itself into a picture over 30 or 40 seconds, and that waiting was itself part of the ritual. Children would kneel in front of the screen to watch it come in. Adults would pull their chairs a little closer. The whole family oriented itself around that screen the way an earlier generation had oriented itself around the hearth. RCA had been building toward this moment for 2 decades. David Sarnoff had demonstrated a working television system at the 1939 World's Fair in New York, broadcasting live from the fairgrounds and receiving the signal on sets placed around the exhibition hall. He stood at the microphone that day and told the crowd that television would become as common in the American home as the radio. The crowd applauded politely. Most of them did not entirely believe him. Within 15 years, he had been proven right on a scale even he might not have anticipated. By 1955, RCA held the dominant position in the American television market. Its sets were sold in department stores, appliance shops, and furniture showrooms from coast to coast. The company's manufacturing plants in Camden, New Jersey, and Indianapolis, Indiana were running at full capacity. Workers arrived in the morning and left in the evening, having built something they could point to. Something their neighbors owned, something their children watched, something that was in the living room of nearly every house on the block. The experience of buying an RCA television in that era was not like buying an appliance today. It was closer to buying a piece of the future on layaway. A family in Dayton, Ohio, or Baton Rouge, Louisiana, or Spokane, Washington would save for months. The purchase would be discussed at the dinner table. When the delivery truck finally pulled up to the house, the whole family came to the door. Neighbors sometimes came too. The set would be unpacked with a care usually reserved for something fragile and irreplaceable, carried inside, placed in the spot that had been cleared for it weeks in advance, and plugged in. And then the family would sit together in the semi-dark and watch whatever was on, not because the programming was exceptional, but because the act of watching was itself the event. One woman who grew up in Cincinnati in the early 1950s recalled decades later that the night her family brought home their RCA was the night her father cried. He was a tool and die worker who had grown up in a house without electricity. He sat in his chair, looked at the moving picture on the screen, and wept quietly. He did not explain why. He did not need to. RCA understood this. The company's advertising in the early 1950s did not lead with technical specifications. It led with family. Its print ads showed fathers and mothers and children gathered around the set, the screen casting soft light across their faces. Everyone together. Everyone present. The message was not, buy a television. The message was, this is what your family looks like at its best. RCA was selling belonging as much as it was selling hardware, and Americans bought both without hesitation. Then came color. The CT100 launched in March of 1954, the first mass-produced color television available to American consumers. It cost $1,000, which in today's terms would be close to $11,000. It was not a product for working families, not yet. But RCA understood that the way to sell color television to everyone was to let everyone see it first. And so the company arranged for color sets to be placed in the windows of department stores in major cities across the country in January of 1954, tuned to the NBC broadcast of the Tournament of Roses parade and then the Rose Bowl, the first nationally televised events broadcast in compatible color. That was when the crowds gathered. People who had no intention of buying anything stood outside in the cold and watched. They watched the roses on the floats. They watched the green of the football field. They watched the colors of the uniforms moving against the pale winter sky. Some of them had never in their lives seen a moving image in color. A man who was in his 20s that January and standing on a sidewalk in Chicago remembered it this way many years later. He said it felt like the difference between reading about the world and actually being in it. RCA was not just selling televisions. RCA was expanding what ordinary Americans believed was possible to see. NBC, which RCA had owned since 1926, made the company's position in American culture unlike anything a consumer electronics manufacturer had before or has since. RCA did not merely build the sets that Americans watched. RCA produced much of what they watched on those sets. The Howdy Doody Show, which ran from 1947 to 1960 and was watched by virtually every American child of that era, came through NBC. The Tonight Show, which premiered in 1954, came through NBC. Walt Disney's Wonderful World of Color, which launched on NBC in 1961 specifically to showcase color broadcasting, came through NBC. And every family that tuned in was being subtly reminded that to see it properly, they needed a color set. An RCA color set, this was vertical integration as cultural architecture. RCA built the transmitters. RCA owned the network. RCA manufactured the receivers. From the moment the signal left the studio to the moment it arrived in your living room, you were inside an RCA system. And most Americans had no idea because it did not feel like a system. It felt like television. It felt like America. The employees who worked at RCA in this period describe it with a consistency that is striking across interviews and oral histories. Engineers at the Princeton Laboratories, RCA's research division, one of the most productive private research facilities in the world at the time, used the word mission without irony. They were not working on products. They were working on the future. Technicians on the factory floor in Indianapolis talked about the sets they assembled, the way craftsmen talk about things made by hand. They knew which model was theirs. They watched for it in neighbors' windows. They felt the connection between the work they did and the life that resulted from it. That connection between the people who built the thing and the people who lived with it was the invisible architecture of RCA's greatness. It was not in the patent portfolio or the balance sheet. It was in the fact that the people inside the company and the people outside it were, in some fundamental way, building the same thing together. What was it about that blue glow in a darkened living room that made a generation feel for the first time that the future was theirs to watch? The answer was not the technology. The answer was the trust. Americans trusted RCA the way they trusted the telephone company and the post office, as infrastructure, as given, as something that would simply always be there. That trust, built over 3 decades, was the most valuable thing RCA owned. More valuable than its patents, more valuable than NBC, more valuable than its factories. And it was the one thing that could not survive what was coming next. The decision to expand beyond television did not feel like a mistake at the time. The decision to expand beyond television did not feel like a mistake at the time. It felt like ambition. And in the early 1960s, ambition was exactly what America expected from a company like RCA. David Sarnoff was in his 70s by then, still chairman, still the commanding presence at 30 Rockefeller Plaza, still capable of filling a room with the force of his conviction. But the company he had built was facing a question that every dominant corporation eventually faces. What do you do after you have won? RCA had won radio. RCA had won television. The color TV market was growing faster than anyone had projected. NBC was the most watched network in America. The Princeton laboratories were producing research that other companies would spend decades trying to replicate. By any measure, RCA in 1960 was at the top. And that, it turned out, was precisely the problem. When a company reaches the summit, the pressure does not go away. It changes direction. Instead of pushing upward, it begins pushing outward. Boards of directors and shareholders look at a dominant business and ask why its success cannot be replicated in other categories. Management consultants arrive with charts. The word synergy begins to appear in internal memos. And the executives who built the company on focused, disciplined innovation find themselves being steered toward a model that has a different name in different eras but always means the same thing. Do more, own more, be more. In the 1960s, that model was called the conglomerate. The logic seemed sound. A company with RCA's capital, brand recognition, and engineering talent could theoretically apply those advantages across multiple industries. If RCA could master radio and then television, why not computers? Why not car rentals? Why not publishing? Why not food? The era rewarded this kind of thinking. Wall Street valued diversified companies. Business schools taught that spreading across industries reduced risk. And so RCA, the company that had been built by a man who believed in doing one thing until it changed the world, began doing many things at once. The expansion moved quickly and in several directions simultaneously. In 1966, RCA acquired Random House, the prestigious New York publishing house. The rationale was that content and technology were converging, that a company owning both the pipe and the programming was better positioned than one owning only the pipe. It was a theory that was not entirely wrong, but it was about 30 years ahead of the infrastructure that would have made it work. Random House and RCA had almost nothing in common operationally, culturally, or strategically. The acquisition created a management distraction that produced little value and considerable confusion. In 1967, RCA acquired Hertz Corporation, the car rental company. This one was harder to explain on any grounds other than size. Hertz was profitable, RCA was profitable. Together they were larger. That was, in essence, the entire thesis. There was no technological connection, no shared customer base, no operational overlap. What there was for a few years was a consolidated balance sheet that made RCA look like a growth company, even as its core electronics business was beginning to face pressures it had not yet fully acknowledged. Banquet Foods followed. So did CIT Financial, a consumer lending operation. By the early 1970s, RCA was a company that made televisions, owned a television network, published books, rented cars, sold frozen dinners, and offered consumer loans. The man on the factory floor in Indianapolis building RCA color sets had almost nothing in common, operationally or culturally, with the man managing a Hertz fleet in Atlanta. They worked for the same company. They might as well have worked on different planets. Meanwhile, on the electronics front, RCA was making a move that its engineers would later describe as the most consequential and most avoidable mistake in the company's history. In 1965, RCA launched the Spectra 70, a line of mainframe computers designed to compete directly with IBM's System 360, which had been introduced the year before and was rapidly becoming the standard architecture for American business computing. The decision to enter the mainframe market was not irrational on its face. RCA had the engineering talent, it had the capital, it had the brand. IBM's dominance was not yet absolute, and several competitors, Honeywell, Burroughs, Control Data, were carving out positions in the market. What RCA did not have was IBM's sales force, IBM's service network, IBM's decades of relationships with corporate purchasing departments, or IBM's willingness to play a long and expensive game. The Spectra 70 was a technically competent machine. It was compatible with IBM software, which was a deliberate strategy to attract IBM customers who wanted an alternative. But attracting IBM customers required being in the same room as IBM customers, consistently over years. And that required a sales and service infrastructure that RCA was never fully willing to fund. By 1971, after 6 years and an estimated loss of between $250 and $500 million, the exact figure was never cleanly disclosed, RCA exited the computer business entirely. It sold its computer operations to Sperry Rand and walked away. It was the first time in the company's history that RCA had entered a technology market and lost. Not lost ground. Lost entirely, retreated. The people who noticed this most acutely were not the analysts on Wall Street. They were the engineers in Princeton. They watched the computer division get sold off and understood something that the executives in the boardroom had not yet articulated. RCA was no longer willing to fight for the future at full cost. The company that had invented compatible color television by refusing to accept anyone else's standard. The company that had built NBC from scratch. The company that had spent years developing technology before the market was ready to receive it. That company had just flinched. One engineer who worked at the Princeton labs in the early 1970s described the atmosphere after the Spectra 70 exit in terms that stayed with everyone who heard them. He said it felt like watching a great athlete decide, for the first time, not to compete in an event he might lose. You could understand the logic. You could even agree with the reasoning. But once you had seen it happen once, you could not unsee it. You knew it could happen again. It would. The factories in Indiana were still running. The NBC ratings were still strong. The RCA name was still on the television sets in more American living rooms than any other brand. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. From the inside, the people who understood what it took to stay ahead in technology knew that RCA had just made a choice, and that the choice had consequences that would take another decade to become visible. The brand was still everywhere, but the nerve that had always driven it forward, the willingness to bet everything on what came next, had been tested for the first time, and it had not held. At the moment Neil Armstrong stepped onto the surface of the moon, the camera that showed it to the world was an RCA camera. That detail is not incidental. It is the clearest possible statement of what RCA was in July of 1969. Not merely a company that made televisions, but the company that had built the instrument through which 600 million human beings witnessed the most watched moment in the history of the species. The signal traveled 238,000 miles from the lunar surface to the Earth, and then it traveled the last few feet from an RCA television screen into the eyes of an American family sitting together in a darkened living room. And in that transmission, something was completed. A circuit that David Sarnoff had imagined when he was a teenage telegraph operator on the Lower East Side of Manhattan had finally closed. RCA had reached the moon, and it had brought America with it. To understand what that meant, it helps to understand what 1969 meant. The country was fractured in ways that felt, to the people living through them, possibly irreparable. The Vietnam War was consuming young men and dividing families. Cities had burned in the summers of 1967 and 1968. Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated within 2 months of each other the previous year. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago had produced images of police beating protesters in the street that were broadcast live on television, on NBC on an RCA screen, into living rooms across America. The country was arguing about everything, loudly, and the arguments did not seem to be moving toward resolution. And then on the evening of July 20th, 1969, it stopped arguing. Not permanently, not even for very long, but for the hours between the moment Armstrong descended the ladder of the lunar module and the moment he and Buzz Aldrin returned inside. Something happened in America that had not happened in years and would not happen again for a long time. The country watched together, all of it, across every division of politics and race and class and geography. Americans sat in front of their television sets, the majority of them RCA sets, and watched two human beings walk on another world. Walter Cronkite, anchoring the coverage for CBS, removed his glasses and pressed his hands together and could not immediately speak. In living rooms from Mississippi to Montana, people cried without knowing exactly why, or knowing exactly why, but being unable to say it out loud. A generation that had grown up with RCA television, that had watched Howdy Doody and the Ed Sullivan Show and the Kennedy funeral and the civil rights marches and the Vietnam body counts all on the same screen in the same corner of the same room, was now watching this. The peak size and reach of RCA in 1969 was, by any measure, staggering. The company employed more than 100,000 people across its divisions. NBC reached virtually every American household with a television set, which by that year meant virtually every American household. RCA's consumer electronics business was the largest in the United States, with a market share in color televisions that no competitor had come close to matching. The Princeton laboratories held patents in technologies ranging from broadcast transmission to semiconductor manufacturing to display systems that underpin the entire American electronics industry. RCA's defense and government contracts included work on satellite systems, radar, and missile guidance that made the company as much a part of the national security infrastructure as it was a part of the national living room. This was not a company. This was an institution in the fullest sense of the word, something so embedded in the functioning of the society that imagining its absence required imagining a fundamentally different America. The employees who worked at RCA in this period describe it with a consistency that transcends the particular role or location. A technician at the Bloomington, Indiana plant who assembled color television sets in the late 1960s recalled, decades later, that he never once thought of the work as merely a job. He knew which sets he had built. He watched for the model numbers in store windows on his way home. When a neighbor bought an RCA set, he felt something that was not quite pride and not quite ownership, but was somewhere between the two, a craftsman's connection to the object he had made and the life it was about to enter. An engineer at the Princeton laboratories who worked on the imaging systems used in the Apollo program described the summer of 1969 differently, but with the same underlying current. He said that on the night of the moon landing, he sat with his family in front of their television set, an RCA set, naturally, and watched the image that his work had helped to make possible travel from the moon to his living room screen. He said he did not tell his children that night what his specific contribution had been. He just watched. He said it was the only time in his professional life that he fully understood the distance between the work and the result, and felt that the distance had been worth every year it had taken to cross. That connection between the person who built the thing and the moment the thing made possible was the invisible infrastructure of RCA's greatness at its peak. It was not in the annual report. It could not be quantified in a market share analysis. It was the specific, human, irreplaceable fact that the people inside the company and the people whose lives the company touched were, at their best, part of the same story. The engineer in Princeton and the family in Bloomington and the 600 million people watching the moon landing were all, in that moment, inside something that RCA had built. When was the last time a single American company held that kind of place in the national imagination? Not through advertising, not through market dominance, but through the simple, accumulated weight of having been present at every significant moment for 40 years? The answer for most people alive today is that they cannot remember, because the last company that held that place was RCA, and by the time the next decade was over, it would be gone. The first shadow appeared not on a balance sheet and not in a press release. It appeared in a laboratory in Japan, in a product that arrived on American shores in 1968 and sat quietly on the shelf next to the RCA sets, priced a little higher, looking a little different, and producing a picture that a significant number of American consumers, when they stood in front of both sets and looked carefully, preferred. The product was the Sony Trinitron. And the fact that American consumers were standing in front of it at all was the beginning of the end of something that had seemed, only the year before, permanent. For most of the 1970s, the customers did not notice. That is the nature of institutional decline when it happens to a brand as deeply trusted as RCA. It does not arrive as a single visible event. It does not announce itself. It accumulates in places the customer never sees, in boardroom decisions and engineering budget cuts, in middle management departures, and quarterly targets that quietly reshape what a company is willing to invest in and what it is willing to let go. The customer walks into the store, sees the name they have always trusted, and buys the set. The trust does the work that the product no longer fully earns. And for years, sometimes for a decade, the gap between the trust and the reality remains invisible. But inside the company, the gap was already there. David Sarnoff died on December 12, 1971. He was 80 years old, and he had been the animating force of RCA for more than half a century. In his final years, he had become more symbol than executive, a ceremonial presence at the company he had built, honored and consulted and largely bypassed by the operational management that ran the day-to-day business. But symbols matter. Institutions carry the values of their founders in ways that are difficult to articulate and impossible to replace. While Sarnoff was alive, even in diminished capacity, RCA remained the company he had built in the sense that the people running it had grown up inside his vision, had been shaped by his priorities, had internalized, and consciously or not, his belief that technological leadership was not a strategy, but a moral commitment. When he died, that gravitational center was gone. His son Robert had been elevated to chairman in 1970, a decision that satisfied the logic of dynastic succession and violated the logic of meritocratic leadership. Robert Sarnoff was an intelligent man and an experienced executive, but he was not his father. He did not have his father's technological intuition, his father's willingness to make decade-long bets on unproven ideas, his father's specific and irreplaceable understanding of what RCA was for. Under Robert's leadership, the company continued to function. Revenues remained strong, NBC remained dominant, the color television business continued to grow, but the directional confidence that had always characterized RCA's decision-making began to soften. The company started managing what it had rather than building what came next. The board removed Robert Sarnoff in 1975 after a period of declining financial performance and internal conflict. He was replaced by Anthony Conrad, who resigned almost immediately over a personal tax matter, and then by Edgar Griffiths, a financial executive whose background was in operations and cost management rather than technology or strategy. The signal sent by that succession was clear to everyone inside the company who understood how to read it. RCA was now being run by people whose primary skill was managing a business, not building one. The difference between those two things is not always visible from the outside. From the inside, it is the difference between an institution with a future and one that is living on its past. Meanwhile, on the shelves of American electronics stores, something was changing. The Sony Trinitron had arrived in 1968 as a curiosity, a Japanese television set with an unfamiliar name and an unusual picture tube design that produced a noticeably sharper, brighter image than the sets it sat beside. In its first years, it was a niche product, expensive and foreign in a market that had been conditioned to trust American brands. But Sony was patient, and Sony was consistent, and by the early 1970s, The Trinitron had moved from curiosity to competitor. American consumers who walked into a store and stood in front of a Trinitron and an RCA set and looked carefully at both screens were making a choice that the market share numbers began, slowly, to reflect. RCA's engineering staff was aware of the Trinitron. They had analyzed it, benchmarked it, written internal assessments of its technical merits. The assessments were honest and the conclusions were uncomfortable. The Trinitron's aperture grille picture tube produced a measurably superior image in certain conditions. Matching or exceeding it would require investment in display technology research that the current budget allocation did not support at the necessary level. The memos that carried these conclusions moved upward through the organization and were received by management that was simultaneously managing the fallout from the computer division exit, absorbing the complexity of the conglomerate acquisitions, and watching the SelectaVision development program consume resources at an accelerating rate. The television display research did not receive the investment the engineers had recommended. This was not a dramatic decision. It was not a single meeting where someone stood up and said the wrong thing, and the fate of the company turned on that moment. It was quieter than that and therefore harder to fix. It was a series of budget conversations in which the television research line item was held flat or reduced slightly, year after year, while other priorities consumed the available capital. Each individual decision was defensible. The accumulated effect was that RCA's core product, the color television set, the thing that had built the brand and generated the revenue and created the trust that everything else depended on, stopped improving at the rate it needed to improve in order to stay ahead of a competitor that was improving very quickly. A salesman who worked at an electronics retailer in Cincinnati in the mid-1970s remembered the shift with the precision that comes from having watched it happen transaction by transaction. He said that for most of his career, the sale was easy. A customer came in looking for a television. He showed them the RCA, and they bought it because it was RCA. That was the whole sales process. The name closed the deal. By the mid-1970s, he was noticing something different. Customers were stopping in front of the Sony. They were looking back and forth. They were asking questions they had not asked before about picture quality, about reliability, about what exactly the difference was between this one and that one. The automatic reach for RCA was still there, but it was no longer quite automatic. There was a hesitation that had not existed before. He said he reported this to his RCA sales representative. He said the representative acknowledged it, wrote something in a notebook, and moved on to the next item on his call sheet. Song Xia, Panasonic, was following Sony's path with its own television lines, competing aggressively on both quality and price. Sanyo and Sharp were entering the American market with sets that undercut RCA on price while matching it closely enough on quality that the price difference was difficult to justify. The Japanese manufacturers had structural advantages that were not going to disappear. Lower labor costs, government-supported industrial policy, manufacturing processes that had been refined specifically for the high-volume consumer electronics market, and a strategic patience that allowed them to accept thin margins for years in exchange for market position. RCA had built its dominance in an era when American manufacturing had no serious international competition in consumer electronics. That era was ending, and it was ending faster than the people running RCA were willing to acknowledge publicly, and possibly faster than they were able to acknowledge privately. How long can a brand survive on loyalty alone when the loyalty was earned by a company that no longer quite exists? Replaced, gradually and without announcement, by a different company wearing the same name. The engineers in Princeton who had been at RCA long enough to remember what the culture had been in the 1950s and early 1960s described the mid-1970s atmosphere in terms that were consistent across different accounts. They used words like defensive and cautious and risk-averse, not as criticisms exactly, but as observations about a change in institutional character that they could feel in the daily texture of their work. Projects that would previously have been greenlit on the strength of their technical promise now required extensive financial justification. Research programs that did not have a clear, near-term commercial application were reviewed with a skepticism that had not previously been part of the laboratory culture. The question that had once been, what are we building toward, had become, what does this cost and when does it pay back? That shift in question is the difference between a technology company and a company that sells technology products. They can look identical from the outside for years. The divergence only becomes fully visible when the next technological wave arrives and one type of company is ready for it and the other is not. The wave that was coming had a name, though not everyone at RCA was using it yet. It was called home video. And the decision that RCA was about to make in response to it would consume $580 million, destroy whatever remained of the company's reputation for technological judgment, and deliver the institution, weakened and exposed, into the hands of people who would finish what the decade had started. Was there a moment, somewhere in those years, when someone inside RCA saw all of it clearly? The Japanese competition, the management drift, the budget constraints, the cultural erosion, and understood exactly where it was leading? Almost certainly. In organizations of that size and that complexity, there are always people who see what is coming before the institution is ready to hear it. The tragedy is not that no one knew. The tragedy is that knowing in a company that has stopped listening to the people who know things changes nothing at all. Before a single SelectaVision player reached a store shelf, the engineers who built it already knew it was going to lose. Before a single SelectaVision player reached a store shelf, the engineers who built it already knew it was going to lose. That is not hindsight. That is documented. Internal memos from RCA's own research division, written years before the 1981 product launch, flagged the fundamental mechanical flaw at the heart of the CED system: the capacitance electronic disc. The disc was read by a stylus, like a vinyl record. Every time you played it, the stylus made physical contact with the disc surface. Every play caused microscopic wear. The disc degraded. And unlike a vinyl record, which degraded slowly and gracefully, the CED disc degraded in ways that produced visual artifacts: skips, distortions, dropouts in the image. The engineers knew this. They wrote it down. They submitted it through proper channels. The memos were received. The project continued. To understand why, you have to go back to 1974, which is when RCA's leadership formally committed to the CED format as the company's entry into the home video market. At that point, the investment was already substantial. Years of research, teams of engineers, laboratory space, prototype manufacturing. The number being circulated internally was somewhere north of $200 million already spent. Pulling back at that stage would have meant writing down a loss that the board would have had to explain to shareholders. It would have meant acknowledging that a major strategic initiative had been misconceived from the beginning. It would have meant, in the language that executives use when they mean something harder to say, that someone had been wrong. No one wanted to be the person who said that. And so the project continued year after year, with the cost rising and the competitive landscape shifting in ways that made the original logic of the CED format increasingly difficult to defend. In 1975, Sony introduced Betamax, a videocassette recorder that could not only play pre-recorded content, but record television broadcasts off the air. In 1976, JVC introduced VHS, a competing cassette format that did the same thing. The home video market was not waiting for RCA. It was forming itself around a different technology entirely, one that gave consumers something the CED disc could never offer: the ability to record. RCA's leadership was aware of VHS and Betamax. They were not unaware of the competitive situation. What they told themselves and what they told their board was that the CED format had a cost advantage, that the disc could be manufactured more cheaply than videocassettes, and that price-sensitive American consumers would choose the less expensive option once both were available. The SelectaVision player, they projected, would retail for significantly less than a VCR. The disc titles would cost less than VHS tapes. On a pure price comparison, in a vacuum, the math was not entirely unreasonable. The math was also entirely beside the point, because what American consumers wanted in 1981 was not a cheaper way to watch pre-recorded movies. What they wanted was control. They wanted to record the game when they were not home. They wanted to tape the finale of a series they had been following all season. They wanted to time-shift their lives in a way that television had never previously allowed. The VCR gave them that. The Selectavision gave them nothing they could not already get by renting a tape, and the tape did not wear out. RCA launched the Selectavision CED player in March of 1981. The suggested retail price was $499. The reviews were not unkind. The picture quality was acknowledged as acceptable. The disc selection was reasonable. The price was indeed lower than most VCR decks. But the question that appeared in review after review, in consumer magazine after consumer magazine, was always the same question. Why would someone buy this instead of a VCR? RCA did not have a good answer. A salesman who worked the electronics floor at a department store in Indianapolis during the Selectavision launch period described what happened at the counter with a clarity that no corporate document can match. Customers would walk up, look at the Selectavision display, ask how it worked, and then ask one follow-up question: can it record? When he said no, most of them walked to the next display case and bought a VCR. He said this happened so consistently, so predictably, every single day, that after the first 2 weeks, he stopped being surprised by it. He started being angry, not at the customers, at whoever had decided to put him behind that counter with a product that could not answer the one question every customer was going to ask. The sales numbers confirmed what he already knew. In the first year of availability, Selectavision moved units at a fraction of the rate RCA had projected. The company responded by cutting the retail price, increasing the disc title library, and launching a more aggressive advertising campaign. None of it addressed the fundamental problem, because the fundamental problem was not price or selection or advertising. The fundamental problem was that the product did not do what people needed it to do. By 1983, it was over in every way that mattered, though RCA would not officially discontinue the Selectavision line until April of 1984. In 3 years of sales, the company moved approximately 500,000 units, against an original projection of several million. The disc manufacturing plants that had been built specifically for CED production were shut down. The engineers who had spent years of their careers on the project were reassigned or let go. The total financial damage, by most estimates, was $580 million. Some internal accounts placed it higher. To put that number in perspective, $580 million in 1984 is equivalent to roughly $1.7 billion today. RCA spent that sum, more than the annual gross domestic product of several small nations, on a product that the company's own engineers had warned, in writing, was mechanically compromised before it ever reached the consumer's hands. But the money, as devastating as it was not the deepest wound. The deepest wound was what Selectavision revealed about what RCA had become. The company that had refused to accept anyone else's color television standard in the 1940s and 1950s, the company that had fought the FCC, fought its competitors, fought the entire broadcast industry to establish compatible color TV on its own terms, that company would have killed the CED project in 1977. It would have looked at the VHS format, assessed the competitive situation with clear eyes, and either licensed VHS technology or gotten out of the home video hardware business entirely and focused on content and infrastructure. The RCA of 1977 did not do that, because the RCA of 1977 was no longer the company David Sarnoff had built. Sarnoff had died in December of 1971. His son Robert had succeeded him as chairman and was removed by the board in 1975 after a period of declining performance. The executives who followed came from financial and operational backgrounds, not technology backgrounds. They understood balance sheets. They understood quarterly projections. What they did not understand, what they perhaps could not understand, was the specific kind of institutional courage that technological leadership requires. The courage to kill a project you have already spent $200 million on because the market has moved and the product is wrong. That courage had left the building with David Sarnoff. Who exactly was supposed to stand up in that boardroom and say the words that would have saved the company? And why, in a room full of intelligent and educated people, did no one say them? The answer to that question did not stay inside RCA's walls. It spread to Wall Street, to the trade press, to the electronics industry at large. By the time Selectavision was officially discontinued in 1984, The story of the CED disaster had become a case study in corporate failure that business schools would teach for decades. RCA had not merely lost a format war. RCA had demonstrated in public, with a $580 million price tag, that the decision-making at the top of the company was broken, and the people who had the power to fix it or to buy it were paying very close attention. The news broke on a Thursday. December 12th, 1985. The announcement came through the wire services in the early afternoon, and by the time the evening news broadcasts went on the air, it was the lead story on all three networks, including NBC, which was owned by the company being sold. Anchors read the copy with the particular careful neutralness that television journalists use when the story is about their own house. General Electric had agreed to acquire RCA Corporation for $6.28 billion. It was the largest merger in American corporate history that did not involve an oil company. In offices across 30 Rockefeller Plaza, people heard about it the way people in large organizations always hear about the things that will change their lives. Not from management, not in a formal meeting, but through the specific electricity of a rumor that has just been confirmed. A secretary heard it from a colleague who had heard it from someone on the 32nd floor. An engineer at the Princeton laboratories heard it on the radio driving to work and sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes before going inside. A production technician at the Bloomington, Indiana plant heard it from a supervisor who had heard it from his supervisor who had read it off a teletype machine and did not know what to say. What none of them knew yet, what would take months to become clear, was that General Electric had not bought RCA because it wanted to be RCA. GE wanted NBC, that was the prize. NBC was a cash-generating, culturally dominant, strategically valuable television network at a moment when the television industry was consolidating and the value of broadcast licenses was rising. GE's chairman, Jack Welch, was one of the most aggressive acquirers in American business, and he understood that the NBC asset alone justified a substantial portion of the purchase price. The consumer electronics division, the televisions, the RCA brand, the manufacturing plants, the product lines, was in Welch's strategic calculus, largely secondary, useful for completing the deal, not the reason for it. This was not a secret exactly. It was visible in the structure of what happened next. The acquisition closed in June of 1986. Within months, GE began the process of evaluating what it had purchased and deciding what to keep. The answer, rendered with the efficiency that Jack Welch had made his professional signature, was arrived at quickly. GE would keep NBC. GE would keep certain defense and government electronics contracts that RCA had developed over decades. GE would keep the RCA brand name, which retained commercial value as a licensing property. Everything else, the consumer electronics division, the manufacturing infrastructure, the product lines, the factories, was available. In July of 1987, GE sold RCA's consumer electronics operations to Thomson SA, a French state-owned conglomerate, for an amount reported at around $800 million. Thomson was primarily a defense electronics company. It had no significant history in consumer electronics. It had no established presence in the American retail market. It had never manufactured a television set for American consumers. What it had was capital, a French government mandate to expand internationally, and a willingness to pay for the RCA brand name and the manufacturing infrastructure that came with it. The people who had spent their careers building that infrastructure found out the way they found out everything else, through rumor, through the news, through supervisors who had been told just enough to pass along and no more. In Bloomington, Indiana, the situation was not immediately catastrophic. Thomson kept the plant running. The RCA name stayed on the sets. From the outside, from a distance, it was possible to look at the Bloomington facility in late 1987 and conclude that not much had changed. But the people inside the plant knew what had changed because they could feel it. The decisions that had once been made in Indianapolis or Princeton or New York were now being filtered through a corporate structure headquartered in Paris. The investment in new product development slowed. The engineering staff was reduced. The institutional knowledge that had accumulated over decades, the specific, granular, irreplaceable knowledge of how to build a competitive consumer electronics product for the American market, began to leave person by person as engineers and designers and product managers found positions elsewhere or simply retired and were not replaced. By the mid-1990s, Thomson had shifted most RCA television production to Mexico and then to Asia. The Bloomington plant, which had employed 8,000 people at its peak, closed its doors in stages across the late 1980s and 1990s. The last of the original manufacturing operations were gone by the end of the decade. What Bloomington lost was not just jobs, though the jobs were devastating enough. What Bloomington lost was the thing that company towns lose when the company leaves, the organizing principle of the place. The high school had sent its graduates to the RCA plant for 2 generations. The local economy had calibrated itself around RCA wages, RCA benefits, RCA's presence as a civic institution. The plant had sponsored Little League teams. Its employees had served on the city council and the school board and the volunteer fire department. When it went, it did not leave behind a building that could be repurposed quickly. It left behind a silence that the community spent years learning to live inside. At the Princeton laboratories, the story had a different texture, but the same essential shape. The lab had been, since its founding in 1942, one of the most productive private research institutions in the United States. Its scientists had contributed to the development of liquid crystal displays, photovoltaic cells, the electron microscope improvements that made modern semiconductor manufacturing possible, and a range of other technologies whose commercial value extended far beyond RCA's own product lines. Under GE's ownership, the lab's mission was reassessed and narrowed. Research programs that did not have a clear near-term commercial application were discontinued. The staff was reduced. The culture of pure research, of following a scientific question wherever it led, on the theory that the application would eventually reveal itself, did not survive the transition to a management philosophy that required every expenditure to justify itself against a quarterly timeline. Some of the scientists stayed and adapted. Others left for universities or for the emerging technology companies in California and Massachusetts that were, in the late 1980s, beginning to build the next generation of American technology leadership. They took their knowledge with them. They took the habits of mind that RCA had cultivated, and they applied those habits in places where RCA would never benefit from them. The RCA name itself continued to appear on products. Thomson licensed it, attached it to a line of televisions that were manufactured in Asia at price points designed for the mass retail market, and sold them through the same channels. Department stores, electronics retailers, eventually big box stores, where RCA had once sold sets that represented the leading edge of what American engineering could produce. The name was the same. The logo was recognizable. The chime, the 3-note RCA tone that had appeared in television broadcasts for decades, occasionally surfaced in advertising. But the people who had grown up with RCA, who had saved for months to buy their first RCA color set, who had watched the moon landing on an RCA screen, those people could see the difference. Not always in the picture quality, which was adequate. Not always in the price, which was competitive. They could see it in the feeling the product gave them, or rather in the feeling it no longer gave them. The sense that this object had been made by people who cared about making it well, who had staked their professional reputation on the quality of the result, who belonged to an institution that believed it was doing something that mattered. That sense was gone. What does it mean when a company doesn't die? It just gets taken apart piece by piece, and the name gets sold to someone who uses it as a label? The answer is that it means something specific to the people who loved it. It means that the thing they trusted was not, in the end, protected by anyone whose job it was to protect it. It means that the institution they believed in was always, underneath everything, just a collection of assets on a balance sheet. And it means that the moment someone with enough capital decided those assets were worth more apart than together, the thing they loved was already over. The lights did not go out at once. There was no final day, no ceremony, no moment of acknowledged ending. RCA did not close. It was disaggregated, a word that means, in plain English, taken apart. The network went one way, the brand went another, the factories went a third, the laboratories went a fourth. The people went wherever they could find to go. And the living rooms of America, which had organized themselves around RCA for 40 years, moved on without quite knowing what they had lost. The French did not know what they had bought. The French did not know what they had bought. That is not an accusation. It is, in a precise and documentable sense, simply true. Thomson S.A. acquired the RCA Consumer Electronics Division in 1987 with a clear strategic objective to establish a major presence in the American market using an established brand name, and without a clear operational understanding of what it took to maintain that brand's meaning in the eyes of the people who had grown up with it. Thomson had engineering capability. Thomson had capital. What Thomson did not have was 40 years of accumulated institutional memory about why American consumers trusted the name on the box and what specific promises that name had always implied. The result was predictable in retrospect, though it took longer to become fully visible than anyone expected. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, RCA-branded televisions continued to sell. The name still carried weight at retail. Consumers who had grown up with RCA in their living rooms reached for it out of habit, out of loyalty, out of the deeply human tendency to trust what was familiar. Thomson benefited from that loyalty without fully understanding its source or its limits. The sets were competitively priced, the distribution was in place, the retail relationships that RCA had built over decades transferred with the brand. For a period of years, the machinery kept running on momentum alone. But momentum is not the same thing as motion. And the difference becomes visible, eventually, at the point where trust meets experience. The RCA televisions that American consumers bought at Walmart and Kmart and Circuit City in the 1990s were not bad products. They were adequate products. They were priced appropriately for what they were, but they were not the products of a company that was pushing the edge of what television technology could do. They were not the products of an institution that had staked its identity on being first, on being best, on being the company that showed Americans what the future looked like before the future arrived. They were licensed products, commercially rational, emotionally hollow, and the consumers who had grown up with the original RCA could feel the difference even when they could not entirely articulate it. By the mid-1990s, Sony and Samsung and LG were doing what RCA had once done, defining what premium consumer electronics meant in America, setting the standard that everyone else chased, putting products in American living rooms that made people feel they were holding the future. The difference was that Sony and Samsung and LG were investing billions in research and development, in manufacturing excellence, in the kind of long-horizon thinking that produces genuine innovation. The RCA brand under Thomson was not competing at that level. It was not trying to compete at that level. It was harvesting what remained of a legacy, and legacies, harvested long enough, run out. Thomson itself went through a series of corporate transformations in the 1990s and 2000s, eventually evolving into Technicolor SA, a company focused primarily on licensing intellectual property and providing services to the entertainment industry. The RCA brand became part of Technicolor's licensing portfolio, a name that could be attached for a fee to products manufactured by third parties in factories that had no connection to the engineers or the culture or the institutional ambitions that had made the name worth licensing in the first place. Today, RCA-branded products are manufactured in Asia, sold through mass-market retailers, and priced at the low end of their categories. The brand that once stood for the leading edge of American technology now competes primarily on price. It is one of dozens of names on the shelf, recognizable to older consumers, meaningless to younger ones, carrying a faint historical resonance that fades with each generation that grows up without any personal memory of what the name once meant. The community that felt this most acutely was not in a boardroom. It was in Bloomington, Indiana. Bloomington lost more than 8,000 manufacturing jobs across the decade following the Thomson acquisition. Those were not abstract jobs. They were the jobs that had allowed a generation of working-class families in South Central Indiana to buy houses, send children to college, and build the kind of financial stability that takes a lifetime to accumulate and can be lost in a single announcement. The ripple effects spread through the local economy in the way that economists describe with the word multiplier. Every factory job that disappeared took with it the restaurant meals that worker had eaten, the car repairs, the grocery purchases, the small transactions that constitute an economy at the human scale. Bloomington recovered eventually, in part because Indiana University provided an alternative economic anchor. But the recovery took the better part of 2 decades, and the working-class neighborhoods that had been built around RCA wages did not recover in the same way the university-adjacent parts of the city did. The Princeton laboratories followed a slower but equally definitive trajectory. After GE absorbed the research operation, the focus narrowed from fundamental research to applied development. Staffing declined. Programs ended. The specific culture of the lab, the belief that the most important research was the research whose application you could not yet predict, was replaced by a more conventional corporate R&D model oriented toward near-term commercial output. Several of the scientists who left in the late 1980s and early 1990s went on to significant careers at universities, at Bell Labs, at the technology companies building the internet economy. The ideas they took with them were ideas that RCA had cultivated. The institutions that benefited from those ideas were not RCA. What the broader American technology industry lost in the RCA collapse is harder to measure than factory jobs or laboratory headcount. But it is real and it is consequential. RCA had been, for most of its history, proof that an American company could sustain technological leadership across generations, that innovation was not a single event, but a culture, a set of habits, an institutional commitment to staying ahead that could be maintained decade after decade if the people running the organization understood what they were protecting. When RCA was dismantled, that proof disappeared. What replaced it was not a single successor, but a dispersal. The talent, the knowledge, and the institutional memory scattered across dozens of organizations, none of which inherited the whole. The industry lesson that business schools drew from the RCA story focused on the conglomerate overreach, the Selectivision disaster, the failure to respond to Japanese competition. Those lessons are real and worth drawing, but there is a deeper lesson underneath them that is less often articulated. It is the lesson about what happens when the people responsible for stewarding a great institution stop believing that the institution itself is the point. When the balance sheet becomes the object and the company becomes the instrument, the decisions that follow are logical and the results are catastrophic. GE did not destroy RCA out of malice. GE destroyed RCA out of indifference, which is, in the long run, a more common and more dangerous force. What do we lose when a company like RCA disappears? Not just the products, not just the jobs, but the idea that American technology could be built to last. Built with pride, built by people who believed they were doing something that mattered beyond the quarterly report? The honest answer is that we lose more than we know at the time. We understand the loss slowly over years, as the space where the institution stood remains empty and nothing quite grows back in its place. The American consumer electronics industry that RCA had helped to build did not survive the 1980s as an American industry. It moved offshore piece by piece for reasons that were each individually rational and collectively devastating. RCA did not cause that shift, but RCA's collapse removed the institution that might, under different leadership and different ownership, have been positioned to resist it. What remained was the name, still on the shelf, still recognizable, still capable, in the right light, of summoning a feeling that the product itself could no longer justify. That is what a legacy looks like when it has been used up rather than honored. And that is what RCA became. Not a company, not an institution, not a promise, but an echo. Faint, familiar, and growing fainter every year. There is a photograph that exists in several versions, taken in department stores across America in January of 1954. There is a photograph that exists in several versions, taken in department stores across America in January of 1954. It shows a crowd of people standing on a sidewalk in winter coats, their faces turned toward a plate glass window. On the other side of the glass is a television set. On the screen is the Rose Bowl, grass, jerseys, sky, all of it in color. The people in the photograph are not moving. They are completely still. Some of them have their hands pressed against the glass. Most of them are simply looking with an expression that is difficult to name precisely, but that anyone who has ever witnessed something genuinely new for the first time will recognize immediately. It is the expression of a person who has just understood that the world is larger than they thought. That was RCA at its most essential. Not the patents, not the profit margins, not the corporate org chart or the manufacturing capacity or the licensing agreements. It was that moment, replicated in millions of living rooms across 4 decades, when an American family sat down in front of a screen and felt the future arrive in their home. When a child watched color television for the first time and could not find words for what they were seeing. When a father sat in his chair on a July night in 1969 and watched a man walk on the moon through a camera that RCA had built and felt in some way he could not have explained that the country he lived in was capable of anything. RCA was the technology of American optimism. It was the hardware of the belief that tomorrow would be better than today, that the future was something you could hold in your hands, that progress was not an abstraction, but a thing with a brand name and a warranty card and a place in the corner of your living room. What that meant, in practical human terms, was that RCA was woven into the texture of ordinary life in a way that very few institutions ever manage. It was the radio in the kitchen where the family ate breakfast. It was the television set around which the neighborhood gathered to watch the World Series. It was the record player in the teenager's bedroom, the color TV that anchored the family room, the NBC broadcast that everyone watched at the same moment in every time zone across the country. These were not luxury experiences reserved for the wealthy. RCA had made a deliberate and sustained commitment. David Sarnoff's commitment, carried forward by thousands of engineers and factory workers and salespeople and broadcasters, to putting its technology within reach of ordinary American families, to making the future affordable. That commitment created something rarer than a dominant market position. It created a relationship, a genuine, durable, multi-generational relationship between a company and the people it served. Grandparents who had listened to RCA radios during the Depression sat with their grandchildren in front of RCA color televisions in the 1960s. The brand moved through families the way certain values move through families. Not discussed, not examined, simply present, simply trusted, simply there. When that relationship was broken, not by failure, not by obsolescence, not by the natural exhaustion of a technology that had run its course, but by a sequence of financial decisions made by people who did not understand what they were holding, the loss was not only economic, it was the loss of a kind of faith. The faith that American institutions, built carefully and maintained with integrity across generations, were permanent, that they could not simply be purchased and disaggregated by someone who saw only the balance sheet and never understood the relationship. That faith turned out to be misplaced, and the lesson of its misplacement is one that the American technology industry has spent the decades since RCA's collapse learning, imperfectly and incompletely, in one company after another. The workers at the Bloomington plant knew something that the executives in New York and the shareholders in Paris did not. They knew that what they were building was not interchangeable with what anyone else was building. They knew that the name on the set meant something specific, something earned, something accumulated, something that could be spent in a moment and could not be replaced by a licensing agreement. They tried, in the ways available to factory workers, to say so. They were not heard by the people with the power to act on what they were saying. The engineers at Princeton knew it too. They had spent careers in an institution that believed the most important work was the work whose value you could not yet calculate. They had produced research that the world was still using in forms they had not anticipated and could not have predicted, decades after they had moved on. They understood, better than anyone, that what RCA had built in those laboratories was not a collection of patents. It was a way of thinking, a culture of inquiry, a set of habits that produced breakthroughs, not because breakthroughs were demanded on a schedule, but because the institution had created the conditions in which breakthroughs were possible. When the institution was gone, the conditions went with it, and the American families who had grown up with RCA in their homes, who had saved for the set, assembled around it, oriented their evenings around its schedule, trusted its name without question across 40 years. Those families did not hold a press conference or publish a statement. They simply gradually stopped seeing the name and feeling anything. The recognition remained. The feeling did not. And when the feeling goes, the thing it was attached to is already finished, whatever the shelf still says. Somewhere tonight, an older American is trying to explain to someone younger what it felt like to watch the moon landing on a television set that their family had saved for, that sat in the corner of the living room like a piece of furniture that had always been there, that bore a name they had trusted without ever having been given a specific reason to trust it, except that the reason was everywhere, in everything, in every year of their childhood and adolescence and early adulthood, confirmed daily by the simple fact that the set worked and the picture was clear and the name on it was RCA. The younger person will listen. They will try to understand. They may even succeed, partially, intellectually, in grasping what is being described. But they will never feel it, because what is being described is not a product. It is not a company. It is not even a brand in the way that word is used today. It is a particular kind of trust that a particular kind of institution earned from a particular generation of Americans, slowly, carefully, over decades. And that was gone before most people knew it was leaving. Some things that disappear leave a clean absence. You know what is missing, and you know why, and the shape of the loss is clear. RCA left something harder to name. It left the faint, persistent sense that something once stood here, something large and reliable and genuinely American, and that whatever replaced it, however adequate, however affordable, however conveniently available on the shelf at the nearest big box store, was not quite the same thing. It never would be.